Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's session with James Bunyan from Ecology. We are delighted to have him here and extremely pleased that he has been able to join us. He's going to be talking to us about the ecological side of how UAVs are used. And I'm just pulling up the information myself. Here we go. So we have today's session is the integration of UAVs and remote sensing into ecological consultancy, a highly topical and a highly forthcoming area for the future. A little bit about James. He has over 15 years of ecological experience working within both the academic and consultancy sectors on a wide range of research and development projects requiring high quality ecological surveys. His skills focus on protected species surveys, ecological impact assessments, otherwise known as EIAs. I had to double check that myself, and has been and is an ecological clerk of works and GIS. Ecology also offers a variety of aerial imagery, surveying and videography services through the use of professional grade unmanned aerial vehicles. As a CAA qualified pilot operating under a permit for commercial operation with full insurance, he can service a variety of aerial surveys needs while working within the ARPAS-UK Code of Conduct. James works within the CIEEM Code of Conduct and produces clear and concise reports suitable for a wide array of clients, which provide unbiased advice through a strong evidence-based approach. The CIEEM is the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, which promotes the highest standards of practice for the benefit of nature and society. So a highly recognised and valuable organisation. Thank you very much, James. I'm going to hand over to you now and mute my own microphone and video.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just hopefully share my screen and we can get started on the presentation. Can you see that okay, Alina? Okay, perfect. Hopefully everyone else can see it as well. Yeah, so firstly, thank you very much to ARPAS for inviting me to talk about how I'm using UAVs, so unmanned aerial vehicles in ecology. There's a little bit about remote sensing as well, but it's mostly looking at UAVs. Firstly, I'm very aware that many of you will probably be far more experienced in the use of UAVs than I, so I would welcome any thoughts as to how things can be improved, and please, later on we can get some questions and I'll do my best to answer. I just wanted a little disclaimer at the start as well. If I ever use the word survey during the presentation, I'm generally talking about ecological survey, so in the context of an ecology survey, rather than as a building or land surveyor context. Generally, I try to refer to the majority of my UAV work as mapping or aerial imagery rather than surveying. So I just wanted to make that distinction at the outset. Right. So just a summary about what I'm going to talk about. Just a brief summary about myself, Ecology, and the ecological survey work I do. We're going to look at why kind of remote sensing, including UAVs, is so valuable in ecological consultancy, the technology and resources that I use, and how those UAVs fit into Ecology's work. And then we'll run through a number of example projects, fairly high level run through, but it'll give you an idea of the kind of breadth of projects that I use UAVs in, and then just briefly look at some of the future applications that I'm looking to explore and develop in the years to come. So my background is relatively varied. I've been working in ecology, well, actually getting on for almost 20 years now, starting off in academia, both as kind of postgraduate and then research, but later moving into consultancy and working firstly in England and then moving up to Scotland about 10 plus years ago, And that's both working as a consultant in wildlife charities, but also very kind of commercial sector. The majority of my ecological survey work is in Scotland and has been in kind of renewable sectors, wind farms and hydro schemes. And it's generally at the pre-planning and ecological impact assessment stage, but to a degree in the during construction and post-construction monitoring phases as well. When I moved to Scotland, I previously worked for a kind of medium-sized interdisciplinary consultancy based in Inverness. But in 2014, I set up as a sole trader and formed Tracks Ecology. And one of the key reasons for that was to try and look at some of this emerging technology, not just drones, but drones was one of those, to see how they could be developed into useful tools for ecological consultancy. I operate throughout the UK, throughout Scotland, but predominantly in the Highlands. But that varies depending on what jobs come through the door. And I do occasionally work south of the border. The sites I work on vary dramatically from very small, less than a hectare, could be a single building, but up to thousands of hectares for kind of large developments such as wind farms. And projects can range from a single visit to long-term monitoring over many years. So it really is quite varied work. Just give you an idea of some of my clients. I don't mind kind of sharing some of the clients I've worked with over the last few years, and you can see there's a fairly wide ranging from kind of larger consultancies, small architectural firms, charities and statutory agencies, and so on. So Tracks Ecology works generally in 5 main areas, and kind of going from left to right is coming from the kind of dominant services to the less so on the right. Most of my work is protected species related. That's where my skill set is probably best. So that's looking at bats, otters, Scottish wildcats, which are all European protected species, and then other protected species such as badgers, reptiles, amphibians, and so on. I also undertake habitat surveys, although to be honest, these days, I personally do less of the habitat work and get some good subcontractors in who can do that better than I. But we do provide a detailed and kind of spatially accurate habitat maps for developments of all sizes. And that involves a heavy kind of GIS component. And GIS, or Geographical Information Systems, is something that I am doing more and more, and do undertake GIS as a kind of standalone service for other ecological consultants, foresters and other people, generally using the QGIS software package, but occasionally Esri products as well. And it's just providing geospatial analysis and information dissemination through kind of detailed figures and so on. Another aspect of my work is ecological clerk of works, and this is where ecologists are employed to monitor developments and ensure that they're compliant with the relevant legislation and potentially planning conditions. So this may be checking that a demolition of a building under, say, a BAT license is being undertaken correctly, all the way up to monitoring wind farm work on a once a week or even more visits to sites over a long period of time. So they can be quite involved projects. And then I also offer a degree of research and training that can be on various aspects, but more and more it seems to be on bespoke kind of ecological and GIS disciplines. So coming from an academic background, when I moved into consultancy, I often struggled with the level of science that's involved. All too often, survey methodologies are quite short. They can involve significant assumptions being made. And although this is starting to change in ecology, it's still the case that you don't often get enough information or enough time to undertake surveys as you would like. And I think historically, ecology has therefore suffered kind of being accused of a bit of a soft science. Often there's a degree of subjectiveness. It can, on occasions, be classed as non-scientific, perhaps, and accuracy and precision is not always high. And this is especially the case for habitat surveys, I would say. And Habitats can form very complex mosaics. Their boundaries can be indistinct. The quality of the habitats can vary significantly, and temporal variation, whether that's seasonal or through the years, can change as well. And there are numerous classification systems. So this all makes a habitat survey quite difficult to undertake to a high level of accuracy. And in years gone by as well, people would produce kind of hand-drawn maps, which was the done thing. Thankfully, most people have now moved over to GIS, but still there is a kind of degree of low resolution perhaps on these maps, and accuracy is not always as high as it should be. Now, the availability of contemporary and high resolution imagery has got significant advantages to that. You can use aerial imagery, say from commercial providers. That's usually around 25 centimeters, which is great, but the potential of using UAVs can take that even more accurate. And these approaches allow for a robust, repeatable, accurate and efficient approach. So the robustness can clearly show the basis for assessment. So if there's dispute over where a line for a particular habitat stops, then you can provide aerial imagery to back up your assessment. It's repeatable, allowing you to assess change over time, which can be accurately measured. It's consistent, so hard to reach areas, say steep ground or inaccessible ground, can also be surveyed to a same level of accuracy. And it's efficient. Large areas can be mapped at relatively good speed, and it allows the ecologists to cover large areas relatively quickly. New advances in GIS, such as semi-automatic classification, also offers perhaps increased efficiency. But what I'm always pained to point out is that my work is always backed up with on-the-ground expertise. So there is always a botanist or an ecologist undertaking ground truthing, species identification, and just making sure that assumptions are minimal with the aerial photography. In addition to kind of UAVs, there's also the availability of aerial, i.e. from planes, and satellite imagery. And much of this is becoming increasingly available and open source, especially the satellite imagery. And we can also get historic imagery, which is incredibly useful for a whole host of things. So I quite regularly now use Sentinel imagery and occasionally Landsat, which is down to around the 10-meter resolution. So it's generally only used on the large scales, but it still provides a huge amount of valuable information. This satellite image is almost always accessed through GIS or Sentinel Hub. They also have the EO Earth Observation Browser, which is extremely useful for getting a quick overview of what data might be available. And additional to the optical, we can also start getting multispectral imagery. So we can start looking at vegetation indices or false color infrared imagery as well, which can provide some interesting insights. And the time series is there. It's available going back many years. So often if you're looking at how a site has changed, then there is satellite imagery available that allows you to look at that. There's also commercial satellite imagery available now, and we have on occasions used this. One example is the Pleiades constellation, which can get you satellite imagery down to around 50 centimeters now, which is pretty good resolution for the vast majority of kind of habitat mapping. I'm sure most ecologies use aerial imagery, whether it's purchased from suppliers such as eMapSite or Blue Sky, which you can get 25 centimeter resolution over much of the UK. Some areas now down to 12.5 centimeters. And obviously there's Bing and Google and so on, which have licensing issues for commercial use, but it's still very useful for oversights on overviews on sites and having a quick look around. There's constraints to a lot of this, especially the satellite imagery. Cloud cover, especially in northern Scotland, the resolution is not always as high as you would like. Some of the satellite information and the commercial aerial imagery can be expensive and difficult to access. And the size of some of this data, I mean, the satellite imagery, especially if you're using multiple bands, can get quite large quite quickly. So managing data can become a bit of an issue, but it's still a very worthwhile data set to consider. The coverage of some of the aerial imagery as well. So certainly where I work up in the Highlands, often the imagery is centered upon urban areas rather than the very rural areas that covers much of my stomping ground. But yeah, usually you can find something from previous few years. So in terms of UAVs in tracks ecology, so soon after going freelance, I was keen to explore the use of UAVs. So I obtained my PFCO, permit for commercial operations, as it was back then, in 2016, and have been using UAVs ever since. Obviously now working under both an A2 CFC and operational authorization for the drone work. And I very much present my UAV capabilities as mapping, like I said, not surveying. I'm fully aware that to be providing survey grade data requires a lot more knowledge than I've got from an ecological point of view. So generally I'm looking at mapping and not surveying. In terms of equipment, the fleet at the moment, I started off with a Phantom 3, which has been retired, but I've still got a Phantom 4 Pro, which I still use for some mapping. There's the Mavic 2 Enterprise Advanced, which has got thermal imaging on, which I will talk about a bit later. I've got the DJI Mini 3 Pro for basic aerial imagery in more confined or constrained sites. And then for a lot of the detailed work, we're using the DJI M300 with both the P1 and the H20 sensors, which is a great piece of kit. And I'm currently looking at investing in the Mavic 3 multispectral, which will be super useful for a lot of vegetation work. So yeah, keeping up with the kit is always an issue, especially as a kind of a small outfit, not centered on UAV services on their own. So it's a bit of a challenge. And return on investment is always a consideration for some of these big purchases. In terms of software, generally I use Pix4D for any photogrammetric work, and then that's combined with QGIS for the GIS. On top of GIS, there's a lot of various plugins for doing particular analyses and so on. And I do occasionally use other photogrammetry and point cloud software, but generally it's a combination of Pix4D and QGIS. One of my main struggles with UAVs is the fact that as an ecologist, a lot of your work is already seasonal and weather dependent, and bringing UAVs into that brings in another seasonal, especially in the north of Scotland, and very weather dependent service. So it's trying to cram in more work into limited and constrained time periods. And some of my work now has to be based around tides as well. So there's a lot of logistics involved in using UAVs, which takes some time to manage. So just some of the advantages, though, I'm sure many of these are pretty obvious, but the ability to get contemporary aerial data on your area of interest is possibly the main advantage. Things like Google Earth and commercial aerial imagery is great, but it's often a few years old. So getting that contemporary data is really, really useful. The repeatability of it all as well is great. So if we're looking at monitoring or looking at change over time on particular aspects, then we can collect that data at the desired intervals. Obviously, the resolution is very high compared to many of the commercially available data, and you have control over that resolution as well. So we're often collecting 2 centimeter resolution. In general habitats, it's not worth going any further lower than that, because you're looking at vegetation which is moving in the wind often anyway. But yeah, generally 2 to 5 centimeters is the resolution we tend to work at. Often we'll look at acquiring imagery for elevation models, whether that's surface models or terrain models, which can be very useful for certain aspects such as peatland restoration and habitat mapping. And obviously you've got the opportunity for additional sensors as well, whether that's infrared or thermal and things like that. So that's a great advantage. The outputs that we create as well can be useful for disciplines beyond the ecology as well. And the kind of cross-selling of this information to a client has become one of the kind of main selling points when you explain that it's got good use for things like LVIA, which is landscape visual impact assessments, hydrological applications, the planning process, forestry planning, and so on. It's a very useful data set for a whole host of disciplines. And it also allows us to access the inaccessible. So whether that's kind of cliff faces or the invisible in thermal or near infrared, this can be very useful for certain ecological aspects. Some of the disadvantages, though, obviously there's additional cost to the client, but generally there's a strong case for the benefits, and they're getting increasingly easier to justify as people are used to this kind of data. There's the additional time and expense to maintain the appropriate equipment, and the additional time and expense to ensure that you're compliant with your operational authorizations and CAA and other legislation and so on. It's a fast developing field. It requires effort to keep up with things, and that's especially the case if you're an ecologist and you don't necessarily have a lot of time or money to put at the UAV side of things. Data volume can be an issue, storing and disseminating data, and your client's use of the data can be an issue as well, along with the kind of software costs and skills for training. And one that I'm very conscious of is the risk of disturbance to protected species. Now, it could be, for example, Schedule 1 bird species, or indeed some of the kind of mammal species as well. So that's always a consideration of mine as an ecologist. I very much treat UAVs as another tool. I'm still an ecologist. I wouldn't really class myself as a drone service provider. And the data I'm collecting using drones is to answer the question that the client needs answered. And I try to avoid overselling where using a drone isn't necessarily going to help to answer that question. So using drones is probably on average 10 to 20% of my project time. But that changes from year to year depending on what's going on. I find having the Mini 3 Pro incredibly useful just to get simple aerial imagery, and that's available at all times on most sites. And I'm now actively seeking collaborations with kind of other UAV operators, so I can offer my clients in the ecology world the best service, really. I can't do everything. I can't really get into LiDAR and fixed wing and various other things due to cost. But it is something that I do collaborate with other providers on. So I was just going to run through fairly high level some example projects to show you the kind of breadth of where I'm using UAVs and some of the outputs from those. So some of the projects I'll look at here is just some simple aerial images. We'll look at woodland creation schemes, bat roost assessments, habitat mapping, which is probably the biggest one, a bit on wildlife forensics, thermal imaging, disease management, some wildlife research applications I'm involved in, and finally kind of peatland restoration work. So like I say, I'll go through fairly high level, and then if there's any questions at the end, we can look at those. So firstly, in terms of kind of aerial images, the ability to place habitats in context with the wider area and show important details such as wildlife corridors and habitat complexities that ground-based imagery struggles to do is becoming really useful in my line of work. So the example here is just some imagery of ponds which we're currently undertaking great crested newt surveys on, and the habitat surrounding the ponds, and the pond habitat itself is very important for undertaking the surveys. There's certain processes such as the Habitat Suitability Index, which requires areas of the ponds covered by vegetation or shading and so on to be calculated. And having the aerial images is just a robust way of undertaking that process, and allows you to easily communicate to the client and possibly the statutory agencies as well. So simple aerial photography is captured with the Mini 3 is an amazing addition to the tool set as an ecologist. It doesn't have to be ponds, it could be various things. One of the things I get increasingly involved in is woodland creation. It's a big thing at the moment, and these projects, there is a need to undertake baseline surveys for habitats and protected species to ensure that these are not impacted upon. But it can also provide valuable information for hydrology and problem species such as bracken. And this is a typical example of a project on the west coast. You can see in the foreground of the photo here, you can see there's some ground preparation for some woodland planting with some plough lines and some mounding already in place. This job project brief was basically to collect existing data for the site, undertake a baseline phase 1 habitat survey, which is kind of the most basic habitat survey. And this identifies habitats of conservation value. And then we provide a detailed map of these habitats to highlight ecological constraints to the woodland planting. The survey work we undertook involved high resolution UAV mapping of the 120 hectare site. And this was at around 4 centimeters resolution or ground sampling distance. And then through the use of that imagery in GIS, we delineated habitat boundaries using orthomosaic. And then after the GIS, we actually undertake the main ecological field surveys to confirm those habitat boundaries, what habitats are present, obtain species lists and habitat quality information. So the GIS is actually done before the main ecological survey, which is I found to be a much more efficient process. And then we returned after the UAV, after the ground preparation, to undertake a second mapping process to be able to map and quantify the ground preparation. So the outputs were high resolution baseline orthomosaic and DSM, digital service model, and then an accurate contemporary habitat map. And then we can undertake detailed measurements of habitat areas, ground preparation areas and associated features. And we can also get the ability to a relatively simple coarse 3D model, but these can be super important for clients. And if I just come off the presentation for a second, I'm hoping that you can see, so this is just hosted in Sketchfab. You can see the 3D model, and what's really useful is communicating why habitats are in certain places. So we can see the purple in here is some bog, blanket bog habitats, and these are situated in these kind of flat areas where you're getting water collection, and again flat areas on top, and all this brown areas on here is bracken, which the clients forwarded on this model to the bracken control contractors who are undertaking spraying from a helicopter, and this supplied useful information for them for distribution and extent and where the bracken was in relation to the topography of the site. So added aspects like that are really useful for the clients. So back to the presentation. We also quite often use these in preliminary bat roost assessments, which many ecologists will be involved in. And this gives us a really good overview of the buildings. We can look at the rooftops to see areas that we would not have necessarily been able to see. And especially when projects involve large complex buildings with multiple features and several roofs, communicating this information to the client or the construction team and statutory agencies can be challenging on 2-dimensional maps and so on. So again, 3D models can be super useful for communicating this information. And the process allows us to access these inaccessible areas. So it's very useful for kind of complex buildings in BAT assessments. We look at invasive species work as well. So this is a project on the west coast, which was looking at rhododendron. So it's just a kind of short fly through here. So this was high resolution imagery captured again. And then based on just the RGB imagery, we were able to map using machine learning processes, automatically map the rhododendron distribution with ground control mapping of rhododendron and other potential kind of green areas such as holly and areas of ivy and so on. So that was a good project, which was a rapid assessment of distribution of rhododendron for the client, and they've come back for further survey work on invasive species mapping. We do a lot of habitat mapping using drones. This is a site which was quite interesting, undertaken in COVID. We were planned to go out to the site on one of the Scottish islands, but COVID shut down the travel routes out to the island. So in this case, we actually got a drone service provider to provide the imagery for us. We then produced the high resolution orthomosaic, then undertook the detailed habitat mapping, all remotely. And this process, this information was then used for the environmental impact assessment under the remit that the habitat assessment was to be updated pre-construction. The habitat survey and assessment went through the EIA process, and then during or prior to the construction, update surveys were undertaken, and my understanding is very, very little change was undertaken. So it was a success keeping the project moving through COVID, and the final kind of high resolution mapping was used for the assessment process. We also had the added bonus of being able to offer some insight for the peatland management. And here you can see on the left, there's some old peat cuttings, which we were able to give rough volumetric calculations to feed into the peat management and habitat management plans for the site, which was extremely useful for the clients. One area I'm looking at doing a bit more on is wildlife forensics. So this is a sunfish. For those of you who don't know, this was washed up on Rosemarkie Beach, which is just down the road from me. And this 3D model was actually just created for fun, as it were, using an iPhone. And again, we can see, if I just hop out onto the web, we can see that the model that's created is a nice model of a sunfish. And this particular sunfish was retrieved by Edinburgh Museum, and I believe is now on show in Edinburgh Museum. And they also have the digital model for kind of public engagement work. So I think things like wildlife forensics may become more frequent, and this process may also be useful for things like wildlife crime. So there may be the ability to, although it may not be from drones, it's using similar approaches, using photogrammetry. It may be a very useful tool to record scenarios to do wildlife in 3 dimensions. I use thermal imaging. A few years ago, I was looking at buying thermal camera. And when I was looking at thermal cameras, the Mavic 2 Enterprise came on sale, which had a thermal camera on at similar resolution to what I was buying at a similar price to a standalone camera. So I now use the Mavic 2 Enterprise with its thermal camera both in the hand and on a tripod for undertaking batch surveys. It's great because you've got the screen. I can be in one place and have imagery visible on what's going on the other side of the building, for example. So here we've got bat flying out of a roost. Or I can be outside the building with bat detectors with insight to what's going on inside the building. So here's inside a barn with a few bats flying around. So although it's not flying, it's using a drone, and it's extremely useful having that remote, so I can see the the images as they come through. But increasingly, we are looking at using it for aerial imagery as well, for protected species and deer management and aspects like that. So we have done a little bit of work looking at seals. So these are some seal research site that I'm working with academic institution on, looking at the thermal imaging with the seals, which they show up quite nicely, especially if they've just hauled out. You can see a bit more there, comparing the kind of standard optical and the thermal imaging. And deer management with thermal imaging, whether that's from a forestry point of view or from a deer census point of view, is something as well that's becoming more and more interesting to use. Done a bit on disease management. So this was a project on a triple SI, so Site of Special Scientific Interest, in southern Scotland, looking at juniper dieback. So we used a combination of RGB and near infrared to obtain data on the site and allow us to produce an NDVI, so normalized differential vegetation index, to really kind of pop out visually the areas of dead vegetation. And then through further analysis, we could really map the areas of juniper dieback, and that would allow monitoring and assessment of impact over time. So that was at the time a Scottish Natural Heritage project, which was a good one to work on. Bit of wildlife research. So as I said, we're working on some seal research with an academic institution, and this is looking at two things. It's looking at using photogrammetry to obtain detailed two-dimensional and three-dimensional measurements of seals, but also getting high-resolution imagery of individual seals to feed into an artificial intelligence system to try and automate individual recognition ID, allowing rapid population assessment processes. This is something that's been done for a number of years using shoreline photography, but they have issues with kind of heat haze and obscured views of the seals. So taking that approach to aerial imagery has been a massive step for the researchers, and now they can capture all the seals that are there, maybe 100, 150, 200 seals in one day, high resolution, clear images, and we're working on the kind of population modeling of that. Just moving on to peatland restoration, I'm conscious of time. High resolution imagery of peatland restoration projects is becoming extremely valuable. So we can produce the elevation models, the orthomosaics, but more importantly, we can then start using GIS to do semi-automatic classification of bare peat, as you can see here, and taking that even further, looking at identifying hags, which are the vertical exposed peat surfaces. And not only can we identify those based on topography and the bare peat identification, we can always also look at how high they are. And this provides a lot of information for the planning of the restoration and the costing of the restoration, which has to be fed into the grant processes for Peatland Action and Nature Scot. So that's an evolving process at the moment, which we're looking to develop further, but has some really promising results. And just quickly on satellite imagery. Satellite imagery has the benefit of being able to go back in time. As I said before, it's generally at larger scale, so it's larger projects we're looking at. But a nice example is a site that we had to undertake some habitat surveys on in northern Scotland. And while on site, we were noticing that there was some historic burn evidence. And we wanted to know what the extent of that was. Now, because it was a few years old, the vegetation was growing back, so it's quite hard to see where the boundaries were. So to inform the habitat surveys, we use satellite imagery to look back in time. And if you're lucky enough not to have the clouds present on and around when the fires were, then you can really see the extent of the fires. So you can see here these fires. You can see the burn area and fires still burning in the northern half. And through things like false image colors, you can really see the areas, and then NDVI analysis as well can pick out the impacts on that, and that can be fed into our habitat assessments and then feed into habitat restoration plans and various other things like that. So in summary, looking forwards, I'm kind of looking at doing a lot more on kind of peatland restoration work, planning and monitoring approaches, and streamlining of the data. Forestry and woodlands is increasingly interesting, integrating high resolution habitat surveys with planning. Ecological digital twins may be an interesting new process that's likely to come on in the next few years. Species distribution and monitoring using multispectral is another area of interest. Using drones for incident response and monitoring, if you're doing ecological clerical works, is becoming increasingly useful. And long-term monitoring vegetation change is something I'm looking at further as well. And then there's new stuff coming on as well. So multispectral is a big one, I think, coming on. Using UAVs and habitat restoration and rewilding is another evolving area. Further integration of satellites, aerial UAVs, and on the ground to combine a real thorough and efficient ecological service is key aspect to my future work. Protected mammals and thermal imagery may be a useful one. Wildlife telemetry is an interesting one. We might start being able to use UAVs to get better line of sight, to undertake radio tracking and remote download of GPS collared animals, accessing the inaccessible, whether it's contaminated land or nesting sites on cliff face vegetation and so on. And then further integration into GIS is really where my area is developing, really taking all this information, using it as best you can in GIS, and answering those questions for the client. But as I said before, it's always combining with on-the-ground expertise to validate and ground truth, as well as assess the habitat quality and species diversity and so on. So I realize it's a bit of a rush, but thank you very much. I will stop sharing and pass back to Alina.
Hi, thank you, James. That was amazing. As you say, a very quick, very speedy overlook at everything that you do. But what an incredible breadth actually within it, and amazing detail. Thank you very much indeed. So we've had 3 questions in already. Please, everyone else, do feed them through, because that's why we're here. And the first one comes in to ask, do you have advice or recommendations for cost-effective storage of raw UAV data, as well as the orthomosaic outputs?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your client. I think one of the things is you really do need, especially in my field where the client may not be used to big data, you need to make them aware that some of the orthomosaics could be very large. Do they have the ability to manage and store that data? So that should be a question early on in the process. Generally, I will say to my clients that data will be stored by myself for a certain period of time, but they should make provisions to store their data as well. And at the moment, generally, data is provided to the client on hard drives and the like, rather than cloud-based, for 2 reasons. One, to keep costs down, but also that's generally how my clients are wanting to receive it. They don't always have good connection to any cloud services, so generally they are still wanting to receive it on standalone SSD drives or similar.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Next question. In your experience, how accurate do you find the orthomosaic outputs in comparison to the ground truthing? Are there specific habitats that the process seems to find more difficult to confirm without boots on the ground? Okay,
I think Richard might be asking about the more kind of semi-automatic classification process, and it varies. If I'm honest, at present, as a standard, I tend to do automatic classification on the relatively easy stuff. So that would be bare rock or bare peat, are two good examples. And then the majority of the other habitats will be a combination of using the aerial imagery to manually map combined with on the ground information. but I am looking at increasing that automatic process. And in my experience, the things like bare peat and rock is very accurate. It's not only is it accurate, but it's going to have more patience. The computer's going to have more patience to draw around small features such as rocks and bits of bare peat than any GIS mapper is likely to. So overall, it does give a much better and much more accurate output. In terms of more less defined habitats such as grasslands and flushes and heathlands and so on, it still works pretty well. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's a model, so you have to work within the kind of parameters of the model and make your client aware that that's the approach you're taking. But often it is as good as, if not better than surveyors. But like I always say, we are still doing on the ground truthing and validation of that process. So there's not a blind classification process occurring.
That's great, thank you. So I'm going to slightly change this next question up. Do you use AI, and if so, what type of AI processes are you using?
So it depends what you mean by AI. I would say we're using machine learning rather than AI, but definitions are a bit loose. But in terms of the habitat work, yeah, the machine learning process is, I've used various things. So there's the semi-automatic classification process. So within QGIS, there's a plugin that allows you to do various things for that, which is great. It's an amazing tool. And then there's other plugins for semi-automatic classification that we use, and different ones suit different projects and solutions. But there's a number there that I'm happily discuss further. But the AI work done for the seals, that's been managed by the university I'm working with and their kind of computer team there. But yeah, I think AI and machine learning and these things are going to come into their own a lot more as we go forward, for better or worse. But yeah, it's mostly machine learning on the mapping side I'm using.
That's
Hopefully
great.
that answers the question.
The next question: are any of your sensors able to penetrate river water surface for riverbed material monitoring for freshwater habitats, for instance? Or would that potentially be more into sort of water drones, essentially?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't do any ROV stuff. It is something that I'm thinking about, because there are certain protected species, such as, say, freshwater pearl mussel, that generally relies on people getting in the water and looking, which can be problematic. Rivers are tricky to use ROVs in, obviously, because they've got flow, but depending on the river, it could be an option. In terms of aerial observations of aquatic environments, it can be possible. I have done harbour work where...
Oh, sorry, for a moment. It looks like we've had a brief
mapping of habitats.
James,
on a harbour.
Could you just repeat that? I don't know whether everyone else experienced that, but you paused for a moment there.
Okay, sorry.
We're just starting on your harbour.
Yeah, so we did a harbour project which was looking at habitats, but we did cover the kind of foreshore as well. And due to COVID, the benthic people who were going to come out and undertake the surveys couldn't get out. So we provide the orthomosaic, and they were able to use that because it's a very calm day, and they were able to use that to assess to a degree the benthic habitats are in the kind of the harbour area. So there is scope for using it, but it will very much depend on the visual. Now, in terms of penetrating water, yeah, I mean, some sensors are better than others. So you may be able to get some penetration, but it's difficult at the moment, I would say.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Do we have any further questions? I have to say that was extremely comprehensive, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Indeed. We talked yesterday briefly when we were planning today about ecological digital twins.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a fascinating concept. Digital twins, obviously, within the UAV world, within drones, are absolutely not acknowledged, and everyone knows what they are. What's an ecological digital twin?
Well, yeah, again, kind of definitions is always quite a bit of a question on these things, but I would say a digital twin is essentially the model of the real world scenario. So in most cases, as we're talking, that's going to be a digital model. So let's just say a 3D model of a location, but then it will be putting in obviously all the existing survey information that's available for that site, but then this will be updated on a regular interval. Now, this could be updated with surveyors going to the field and updating that model, or it could be updated with sensors in the field relaying information back on a either live basis or on a daily or weekly basis. Now, for ecology, one example is I'm doing some work again with the university who are looking at a small island. It's about 70 hectares, and they do a lot of bird research on there. We now have a very detailed 3D model of that, and they're looking at getting live sensors on that island to measure things like weather, potentially looking at automated assessments of birds returning to nest sites through kind of RFID tags and radio tags and so on, and camera trapping as well. So it may be possible where we have this model of this island and you're getting sensors relaying information back real time, and then you can start creating this 3D digital model of the island. And they're also looking to use that for education. So field trips to the island they do undertake, but they're problematic in terms of cost and logistics and so on. So they may get to a stage where you can almost do digital field trips to look at what birds are there at this precise moment in time, because you've got real-time live feeds coming in, what's the weather doing, and all these kind of things, and then start using that to model the impacts on the birds and other ecological features.
Fascinating. Yeah, absolutely fascinating how the technology can enable all of this. Really, really interesting stuff. Do we have any last questions? Please do add them in while you're coming up with those. I will tell you a little bit more about forthcoming CPDs with ARPAS. We have one at the beginning of June on UAVs and agriculture, including spraying and spreading. And as a reminder, our CPDs and webinars tend to focus on three predominant areas: the safe adoption of drones by various industries, proportionate regulations, and future-facing subjects. They are all available to watch again once they've actually happened on our website, and indeed they are now all on YouTube as well. So please do like and subscribe, as they say. We're very pleased indeed if you want to let us know if there are other subjects you would like us to find speakers for and arrange further information about this. We are particularly keen, obviously, to hear from our members to do this, because this is very much seen as a benefit to them too. So we've not had any more questions come through. If any do, I'd be delighted to forward them on to James. Oh, here we go. Thinking of further applications, to what height can the thermal imagery work at? Thinking of monitoring of more secretive SPP, such as black grouse?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on the target animal. So some of the things we're looking at potentially using it for is wildcat, Scottish wildcat, which are incredibly difficult to survey, especially in kind of windthrow or brash habitats, which is where they like denning. But looking at an example, say, of black grouse, I must admit, I don't have a huge amount of experience undertaking this on birds, but what I do know from birds is they're pretty well insulated. So obviously thermal imaging is picking up their thermal signature. So if you have something that's very well insulated, they can be tricky to pick up. But there is work being done on species such as black grouse. Disturbance may be an issue there, but yeah, you can fly, say, 120 meters up, and you'd probably still, with my sense, you'd probably still pick up a black grouse, a fairly chunky bird. But yeah, it'd be something to look at exploring.
And obviously, just as a little brief reminder, 120 meters is the highest you can fly.
Under standard permissions.
Yeah, exactly, under standard permissions, indeed. Thank you. With peatland restoration, what size areas are you mapping? And with larger areas, sort of 100 hectares plus, how do you do that?
Yeah, so the kind of subsample image I showed of the peatland work, that was a site that was 450 hectares, I think. That site in particular, we mapped using the DJI M300 with the P1 sensor, and is multiple flights. So multiple flights over, I think, 2 days in the end, and then stitching, I think, almost 10,000 images together to produce the high resolution orthomosaic. So yeah, it's challenging. It's a lot of data, but yeah, it can be done. I mean, once you get above, say, 300, 400, 500 hectares, you certainly want to think about fixed wing. Now, fixed wing are great in some circumstances. If you've got highly variable topography, they can be challenging to get standardized ground sampling distance. But it may be worthwhile looking at fixed wing. And then, if I'm honest, above 500 hectares, I start speaking to the guys who fly planes, because that starts becoming probably the most efficient way forward to collect some of this information, depending what you're after and the resolution needed. But yeah, up to 400 or 500 hectares is relatively straightforward with UAVs.
That's great. That's a really useful answer. Thank you. Well, that sort of is bringing us all but right to the very last seconds of today's CPD. So thank you very much, James. Thank you very much to everyone who has attended. I will send out the links this afternoon so that anyone who has missed it, or if you would like to forward it on to colleagues, they can watch it again. James's contact details will be included, and absolutely you can contact him directly about any further queries you might have, or if you wish to engage the services too. Thank you very much, James. And,
no, thank you.
Brilliant session. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you very, very much. And we will look forward to seeing you again soon.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much then, everyone.